Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily Now.tv chat show with some of the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is Sunday, March the 24th, 2024. I just got off a plane from New Orleans, and that's why our start the week, or that was the week episode, our roundup, our weekly roundup of technology was delayed a couple of days. It's been quite a week in technology, a week which, at least according to Keith Teare, the author of That Was the Week newsletter, suggests a degree of shame. Was it a shameful week, Keith?
Well, it's a shame if you believe in professionalism and the rule of law, because the nation's top legal body, the DOJ, I guess you could argue that the Supreme Court is the top legal body, but certainly on the executive side of the house, has decided to file a complaint against Apple for abusing monopoly power. And the unanimous response, at least from what I read, is to hold the DOJ in ridicule for having brought the complaint. That's the gist.
Well, I'm not sure there's ever been a monopoly case that you'd be sympathetic with. Is that a reflection of what and who you read?
Probably that is somewhat true, because I haven't read anyone. I literally haven't read anything that is defending the DOJ, but I do believe in this case it's because their case is so flawed that it would be super hard to support them.
So what is the case, the DOJ case against Apple?
They make 5 points, actually, but the broad thrust of it is that Apple is a monopoly in a market that the DOJ has defined as top-end smartphones. So it's had to, if you like, it can't accuse Apple of being a monopoly in smartphones because it only has 20% of the market globally and about 50% in the US. So it's defined a smaller market. It has language to describe, superior smartphones, basically. And it gets to Apple being 65 to 70% in that market, and then adds in Samsung and says between the two of them, they're 90%. So it's a kind of a sleight of hand to create a market that none of the rest of us recognize as a market. We think of it as a small part of a bigger market. So it's really jumping through hoops to try to define the scope of monopoly.
Given the DOJ's ongoing cases with Google, some with Amazon as well, do you think Apple just had it coming, that the DOJ felt, well, if we're going to go after Google and Amazon, we've got to go after Apple too?
Well, I think based on the modus operandi at the DOJ, which I believe is inspired by Lena Khan's...
your friend, the graduate student, right?
Yeah, her PhD paper. Given their modus operandi, where I think the crime is to be big, not to be a monopoly and abuse monopoly power, but simply to be big and powerful is a crime, because it gives you pricing power and all kinds of other things. Now, the Sherman Act, which is the Antitrust Act, doesn't really cover those things, but the philosophy at the DOJ and the FTC is to go after those things. So they have to really file complaints against everyone if they believe their own philosophy. And
so the Sherman Act suggests that if large companies are doing harm, am I correct if they're doing harm to consumers?
Not really large. They have to be monopolies with a capital M.
Right, they have to be monopolies, and they have to also be doing harm to consumers.
They have to be abusing monopoly power, yeah.
And what about...
And by the way, to answer your earlier question, Anna, there are some obvious abuses of monopoly power, like price fixing, between all the players. So if Google and Apple were meeting in a dark room and setting the price of phones, that would be an appropriate focus. But Google...
But they haven't, because Google's not a phone maker.
It does make phones, but many, many more phones are made using Android than the ones Google makes. So it doesn't really work. So there really isn't a solid case that there's a monopoly here.
So what about the argument, and this issue's been dominating the legal community now for years, that Apple's operating, that the Apple Store or the App Store operates a kind of monopoly because they control everything?
Well, if you want to discuss that as a serious proposition, not you and me, but if anyone does, you've got to take into account how many app stores there are in the world for how many different types of smartphone. And the answer is lots. And Apple's app store for its iPhone is just one. So given that Apple built the iPhone and wants to make sure that the apps that go on it are safe, it doesn't seem unreasonable that it should curate its app store and have some rules.
I'm guessing your dog is just as outraged by you about this latest.
I think our listeners are tolerant enough for me to go and stop it. Let me
stop the dog and imagine it's Lena Khan. Give it a good kicking, Keith.
Luna.
We can talk while Keith's away, shutting his dog up. Probably a pro. Is that a pro DOJ dog, Keith?
It may be objecting to my narrative. That's entirely possible.
I think it's probably offended by your narrative. Shame on you. Yeah. In all seriousness, no, do we need to use this word shame? I hate this word. It's such an annoying word. Why? What's so shameful about it? It's a political initiative. Clearly, the Biden administration or the DOJ under the Biden administration doesn't much like big tech, so it's going after Apple. So what? It's not shameful.
Well, don't you think? I mean, this is serious now, just between you and me.
No, I was being serious.
Don't you think they're shooting them? Well, don't you think both TikTok and Apple are the two targets you wouldn't want to go after if you want young people to support you?
I don't know about Apple. I mean, I would use the word shameful in terms of TikTok. I think that is shameful to try and shut the thing down or force a sale. But with Apple, it's
actually
using it. It's swings and roundabouts. It's the nature of big tech and of a state that's seeking to somehow control it. You know, this isn't going to work out. There's no way that the DOJ is going to be successple with this.
I'll tell you what.
Even when they got good cases, they usually fail. And this is clearly a stupid case.
Yeah, I agree. And a bit of a challenge here. If by the end of the show, we can come up with a better headline for this week's newsletter than DOJ shame on us, which is intended to say that if they get away with this, that's on us for letting them.
But it isn't on us because none of us control the DOJ. And ultimately, this will be resolved in the courts by incredibly expensive lawyers, maybe even by the Supreme Court. So it's got nothing to do with us. It's certainly got nothing to do with me.
Well, in a democracy, the people always have a voice. And,
yeah, but no one's going to vote on this. No one cares enough. I mean, even if the DOJ got what they wanted, how would that impact Apple and the iPhone ecosystem?
Well, it's hard to know until you know what the specifics would be. Steven Sinofsky, who's in this week's newsletter, went through this. He was very senior at Microsoft.
Yeah, you've got a good tweet from him. What does Sinofsky say?
He really goes through in some detail why the case has no substance, and he's not really still fighting the Microsoft battle. He looks at the Apple thing with clear eyes, set in the present, but from a person having gone through exactly this set of circumstances at Microsoft.
But there was a case against Microsoft. You yourself, as a startup entrepreneur, had one of your startups killed by Microsoft. So, well,
yeah, but I actually defended them. I put out a press release defending them at the time because I thought competition would deal with Microsoft more effectively than the government, and that ended up being true with Chrome. Now trouncing Microsoft's Edge, which is a tiny browser, and the browser was the crux of the whole case back in those days. Microsoft missed mobile. Microsoft arguably missed the cloud, although they're strong in the cloud now. It's as a secondary player, and they somewhat missed AI. As we'll see this week,
Well, we'll talk about that. And one interesting piece in the one theme in the newsletter is you bring up Kurt Vonnegut's short story, Harrison Bergeron, about on this sort of on the dangers of radical egalitarianism. What's the connection between the Apple case and Vonnegut's short story?
So I read the short story after I sent you the draft of the editorial, and I've added a paragraph to the editorial subsequently, which is exactly answering your question. And if you wanted to reduce the DOJ case down to a kind of a populist phrase, it would be Apple should be as bad as Android, and it's not fair that it's better. And the Bergeron story is a story of the state insisting that everybody is the same and handicapping anybody with natural abilities to make them as challenged.
Yeah, and in the story, there's something called the United States Handicapper General. Everyone has to be equal. And it's interesting. I don't know whether you were influenced by this in terms of your Vonnegut comparison, but Apple is defending itself by arguing that the DOJ is trying to turn the iPhone into Android. That at least is according to TechCrunch, one of the pieces you linked with. How and why?
Well, let's take the iMessage complaint. And anyone who's got an iPhone will be familiar that if you text somebody that has an Android, the bubble is green, not blue. And that's because the Android receiving end can't do everything that the iPhone sending end can. And one of the DOJ complaints is that should be changed, which would mean reducing iPhone's messaging capability down to being equal to Android. That's just one example. And that, by the way, at a time when you can have WhatsApp on both phones and do pretty much anything you want with WhatsApp that's equal. So it's not even as if there's a problem. They're basically saying to Apple, you can't have a better messaging platform. And on the face of it, that's a ridiculous.
Is there acknowledgement within the tech community that Android is a lower end product, less?
Yes.
Less, and Android phones obviously are cheaper and a different kind of customer.
Well, look,
is attracted to Android than the iPhone.
Yeah. Well, let's be balanced. Android is fantastic. It has about 80% market share worldwide. Not just smartphones, by the way. Your TV might be running Android. If you've got a set-top box, it's probably running Android. If you have a projector, it's probably running Android. So Android's everywhere and huge. And in terms of delivering modern capability to people at low cost, it's fabulous. But feature-wise, Apple Photos, Apple iMessage, Apple Mail even, almost every feature that is unique to Apple is better than the Android equivalent, because Apple owns the hardware and the software and can build things that benefit from having both.
So is the case arguing that Apple is not allowed or shouldn't be allowed to bundle these products into their phones? Or is it a case that suggests that these products should be more universal?
Well, both. On the one hand, the DOJ says iMessage should run everywhere. Now, Apple has done that with iTunes. iTunes runs on Windows. There is a way of making it run on Android and even on Linux, because it has a web version. And the DOJ is saying, if Apple made iMessage run everywhere, that would fix the problem. Well, the problem is iMessage's core is security and encryption. And because Apple doesn't own Android, it can't guarantee that.
So it'd be dragging down the quality. The one piece you linked to in the newsletter this week, which has a little bit of sympathy with the DOJ, is by Matt Birchler, who writes about his wife's reaction to the suit. his wife is not a tech person. What does Bircher say, and what is the argument from the point of view of the ordinary consumer?
Yeah. Well, by the way, my wife also started the week very sympathetic to the DOJ, and she and I had some quite riveting conversations about it. So Matt's not the only one with a wife whose instinct.
So what does Janae say? Why is she sympathetic?
She has this natural instinct against big companies that, remember, she's South African and was anti-apartheid. And you and I know history very well, but the whole history of anti-colonialism, which has basically, Cold War Stalinism at its core, is that monopolies are bad things and anything big must be a monopoly. So there's that going on. So there's kind of a leftist anti-monopoly diatribe, which really doesn't care much about.
Leaving aside that, what about the ordinary consumer? So everybody has an iPhone or an Android device. What is the argument, whether it's from Brickler or from Janae Tier or whoever, that this would actually benefit ordinary consumers?
I think there isn't a coherent answer to that question. I think it's just emotional instinct that big is bad.
What about pricing? I mean, iPhones are still more expensive than Android. Is it an attempt to maybe bring down the price, force Apple to bring down the price of their iPhone?
There's a great piece in Bloomberg today that debunks that. I mean, effectively, the iPhone is free if you have a wireless contract. So it isn't really.
All phones are free then, and then that's a moot argument.
Yeah, well, people like me, I'll buy an iPhone at cost price.
You buy an iPhone every week. You're not typical. What about the ordinary person who buys an iPhone maybe once every 3 or 5 years? What?
Ordinary people get their iPhone for the same price you can get an Android phone, basically free. It's built into the $20 or $30 a month you pay.
But it does have a price, a formal price, whether it's $1,000 or $1,100.
It does. It's just that nobody pays that price.
Well, some people do.
Some people do who can afford it, yes, and I do. It goes all the way from, I'd have to go to Apple's website to remember the range now, but I think it starts in the like $399, $499 kind of at the low end. Let's just say iPhone. So if you can start at the iPhone SE, where you get all the software, and if you click buy, the price starts at you've actually got to choose it. Oh, $429. Listen, $429, but they'll pay you between $30 and $630 for your old iPhone.
If you have one. But leaving that aside, what is the politics here? Is it just that the Biden administration probably only has 6 months left? Are they just throwing this stuff at the wall now?
I'd be pretty shocked if Biden has his hands on this, because I think if he could, and obviously there's a Chinese wall between the DOJ and the White House. They're not really meant to have their hands on things, just like the Federal Reserve. There's a wall. So I suspect Biden doesn't have his hands on this.
Yeah, but the Khans of the world know that they may only have 6 months left, because if Trump's reelected, they'll all get thrown out of office. So
the politics really is Elizabeth Warren driven.
Oh, another of your favorite women, Keith. Is it the left? Is this what you're fearful of? The woke left?
Well, it isn't really left, is it? It's a misunderstanding of the role of technology and progress. There's no real understanding in the democratic left that progress comes from technology.
That's a bigger argument, and certainly they do have a good argument when it comes to loneliness and atomization, although I don't think that has anything to do with the case against Apple. This is not a case against technology, it's a case against Apple.
Well, Apple, as you were saying earlier, Andrew, it really isn't. Apple's the fourth case. It's a case against Apple.
But it's not a case against people using technology. They're not saying the premise of this argument is that technology is alienating, therefore we've got to stop people using phones. It's about stopping people using Apple phones.
Yeah, but accusation against Apple, really, they wouldn't use these words, but what it really comes down to is you're too far ahead. Therefore, there's no competition because no one's as good as you. Therefore, we want to make you as bad as everyone else. Now, if
but you sound like an Apple lawyer now. I mean,
no,
what
I
about
know.
the news? You had another interesting piece of news, Keith, this week about Apple is in talks with Google Gemini to power the iPhone AI features. What does this say with these huge companies now partnering to make themselves, for better or worse, even more powerful, whether it's the Gemini AI or Apple?
I actually think it's the opposite case, that this deal represents the failure of Apple to compete with OpenAI or Claude AI or any of Mistral AI or any of the others. And Google, it's their failure to distribute Gemini to a real audience. And so Apple and Google are both losers, clinging onto each other to try to get to something that
losers. I don't know. I think
in the AI race, they're currently behind by far.
Well, they're not losers. The
Like
race has barely begun, and
that's just a
some people argue that Google's Gemini and OpenAI's ChatGPT are relatively equal, but
they're not. They're not. But Claude AI is. I mean, it's even better. I've started using it more than OpenAI now. But that's a startup again. And Inflection AI that Microsoft.
Well, we're going to talk about Inflection because that's.
But the key is that none of them are Apple or Google. And Apple and Google, competition is embarrassing them in the AI space, which is how it should be.
Yeah. Another of the pieces, your video of the week from Jason Lemkin is about the odds of raising Series A funding for your startup. In the context of the broader startup economy, what are the odds, Keith? This is something you know a lot about.
Yeah.
Do you have better odds in 2024 than you did in 2020 or 2015 or 2010? Or is it increasingly controlled by these huge companies like Apple and Microsoft and Google and Facebook?
Well, the hard thing is in venture capital, it takes about 4 years to know what the odds were. A round happens and then you got to wait and see. So what Jason is talking about really is backward-looking data going back to about 2019. And the truth is that almost every investment made in 2020 and 2021 is stalled. That is to say, no subsequent round has happened. So the data will say things are really bad. But the truth is you don't know, because people doing Series A rounds in 23 and 24 may go on to do a Series B and a Series C much faster than that prior cohort. Probably will. I would guess they will. So there's a bit of backward-looking data, and then extrapolating from something that's out of date. And it's not his fault. It's just the way that venture capital.
I understand that, but you have a front seat on this. Is it harder or easier to raise money these days?
Much harder. Although I do believe it's always hard to raise money, but it is much harder because there's less rounds. However, the amount of money being raised has gone up. I can actually show you the trends amazingly, because I happen to run a company that does this. Let me just pull up the web page. But I have to log in while I do it. And I think what you'll see is that the amount of money being raised per round is on a very strong upward tick now in 2024. However, there's a lot less rounds happening.
So from the point of view of the business of the DOJ and the business of the American government generally, I think in terms of tech, is trying to create a level playing field, right? if you were the DOJ, what would you be focusing on? You're always bashing it. You hate Lena Khan, but are there areas where you think they could be working to benefit young entrepreneurs, Series A entrepreneurs with important, interesting ideas?
Well, they already do some of that. If you follow the former AOL CEO Steve Case has a venture fund called Revolution: The Rise of the Rest, and it's a lot of money, and a lot of it's government money, and it's focused on I think they're called enterprise zones, but
I mean places outside the East Coast and Silicon Valley.
Yeah, and they've given all kinds of tax breaks plus money to entrepreneurs.
But that's not a DOJ issue.
It's not DOJ, but it is government.
Where should the DOJ be looking? I mean, they got to do something, Keith. Or you're suggesting they should be just shut it down, like in a Trumpian way, just get rid of it.
No, I think the DOJ's job is to focus on crime, and it isn't. It's focused on politics right now, and that there's a contradiction between the DOJ should only be a legal force, not a political force. And I would have said the same under Trump when he tried to get Biden arrested for the stuff his son did. The DOJ should not be an instrument of politics. It should be purely legal. But Lena Khan was appointed as a political appointee to the FTC.
Well, they usually, I mean, all these appointees are political. You just don't like Lena Khan. What about Trump? He's in the news. He's always in the news, but he's in the news in a tech way this week. Truth Social's going public, might allow him to pay off some of his debt or some of the punishment from other legal inquiries. Is this right? Is Truth Social? I mean, what I've read is that it's not really a company. So how's it raising so much money?
Well, so Andrew, going back in our history, this is a SPAC. It's called the Digital World Acquisition Corporation.
Yeah.
The SPAC is funded by friends of Trump. And what happened late last week is that they agreed to merge with Truth Social, which is how SPACs work, which means the money sitting in the SPAC will now become money on the balance sheet of.
Can they pull it off? Is this just another political maneuver to allow Trump to pay his debt?
I think they will be able to pull it off because inherently it's an inside decision. There's no external authorities really that can stop it. And that will mean that Truth Social shares will have a share price. Now, in the case of most SPACs recently, the share price is reduced by often more than 90% very fast. The starting point for this will be that Trump's shares are worth about $3 billion. The question is, can he get money out before the share price crashes?
Can he? You're the expert on this. I mean, it will look it will look dreadful if he. Who loses the money then? If Trump,
the buyers of the shares.
But why are the buyers of the shares in agreement? Everybody knows what's going to happen. Trump will try and take as much money out as he can, and then the price will crash.
Very likely, which means you've got to go and look at the sponsors of the SPAC and ask the question: is that their expected outcome anyway? And if the answer to that is yes, then the losers will be retail investors who buy the shares on day one.
Bad smell there, Keith, and a bad smell, I think, also another announcement. Saudi Arabia announced a $40 billion AI fund. Saudi Arabia, of course, being one of the most troubling authoritarian states in the world. Are you troubled by this, or do you like Saudi investment?
Well, I think as an observer of Saudi Arabia, you kind of, it would be wrong to have a static view of the country. It's clearly undergoing a lot of change right now, including for women. And one, reads through the lines that the Crown Prince is a modernizer. And then there's the self-interest of oil revenues being assumed to shrink in the next several decades, and Saudi Arabia needing a transition plan to a post-oil world. And they have a lot of money to put behind that, which is probably not a bad thing if you want Saudi Arabia.
If I was writing an editorial this week, I would talk about the shame of this rather than Lena Khan. I mean, how does Lena Khan who might be a bit of a clown, but how does she compare with MBS in Saudi? She doesn't behead people. She doesn't put people in jail.
Well, I don't know. What's your view of Saudi Arabia? Don't you think there's an attempt to change it?
I think that perhaps, but I think their human rights. We've had some shows on Keen on their human rights record, which remains abysmal, worse than the Russians, worse than the Chinese. So yeah, I'm certainly no apologist, but I think you get outraged, shame on us about Lina Khan. I agree, it's an absurd case, but you seem less concerned with the human rights abuses of the Saudis. I mean, Lina Khan's never put anyone in jail. I think she's never tortured anyone. She's never chopped people up into little bits and put them into suitcases.
Yeah, but you know, I personally look at Saudi Arabia as a story of transition. Now, I'll agree that the facts that as you tell them, that's entirely true. But a bit like China, I don't think you get the change you want by pointing out the crimes of the past. I think you have to engage with people and lead them to a better place.
The crime we're talking about, Turkish journalist, was only 2 or 3 years ago. Anyway, is there any good news? There's the Reddit IPO, Keith. Is that encouraging for startup entrepreneurs, investors? Is this a good thing? The IPO seems to have gone rather well. We've had a real shortage of tech IPOs. Does this suggest the beginning of a new market, new appetite for tech IPOs?
Well, there's a fortuitous set of circumstances. It's very good timing. Reddit is not a great business. It still makes a loss after many, many years. However, it's recently started getting large sums of money from AI companies to allow those AI companies to train models on its data. It has a lot of data because it's a huge community-centered site with detailed knowledge of all kinds of specific topics. So it looks as if it's going to become profitable this coming year, and it's part of the AI focus. Its share price went up 48% from that $34 number.
So are you saying that Reddit's value now is that they're using the content to train
models?
The sort of the training, the guardrails. Does everyone who posts on Reddit, do they know that they're helping to build value to OpenAI or Inflection or Gemini?
I would say yes. People are pretty aware. You know, Reddit has a cryptocurrency that it rewards its users in for attention that their posts get. And so there's a kind of a self-built-in incentive for attention. So I don't think most Reddit posters want, you know, their data to be private. They mostly want it to be shared.
So you don't think this is a big deal? You think it's...
I don't think it's a big deal. I think the market for data is only going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. Like, you know, I have 100% of the data as it pertains to venture capital. And then on top of that, I've built some scoring algorithms. I can't tell you how many times a week people call me trying to buy the data from me. And I don't sell it because that's not my business. But data is very valuable.
Well, Reddit, in spite of their IPO, didn't win the most coveted award in tech, Keith Tear's Startup of the Week. That went this week to Neuralink, which has developed a new product showing patient using brain implants to play chess on a laptop. Is this the best news of the week, Keith? The Neuralink news?
Well, it's mind-blowing in that I wouldn't have thought it was possible. But this is a paraplegic. I think whatever the worst is, it's from the neck down, no sensations whatsoever. This was a young guy actually who had an accident, a swimming accident, diving into a pool that was shallow. And you know, he's from the neck upwards, he's fine, but from the neck downwards, he isn't. And they showed him playing chess on a screen using the Neuralink to do very precise movements. Like he could move the cursor and pull down menus and click on options in a very fast, no delay, and move chess pieces and play chess. And the excitement in his voice as he explained what a breakthrough it was for him to even be able to. He couldn't contemplate doing something like that. So the fact that
this is tech for the good. There's nothing dodgy, nothing ambiguous about this. Even if it's an Elon Musk owned company, it still benefits humanity. This would be one of your arguments for embracing technology rather than being Lena Khan-like suspicious of tech, of big tech.
Yeah.
Well, finally, one of the other interesting pieces of news, this was in TechCrunch, was that Microsoft, quote unquote, seemed to have acquired Inflection AI, and this created an X from somebody called Jacob Austin. Always good to know you can be fired from DeepMind for being an arsehole. Abandon your startup, your dollar startup, and still get hired as a Microsoft VP. This was in reference to Mustafa Suleyman, who I think was the CEO of Inflection, who now is head of AI at Microsoft. Why did you choose this X, and what does it tell us about what's happening in the AI space? Well,
it blends a few things in a lovely way. I mean, the first is that this guy is a serious achiever. Being one of the founders of DeepMind, which was started in London, is itself an achievement. Then he left. This tweet claims he was fired. I don't have any insight there, but it could be true.
He was fired. He was the tweet. I don't know why you chose this particular tweet. He was fired from DeepMind when it was part of Google for bullying behavior, and he left.
Oh, that's right. Now I remember. Anyway, he then went on to form Inflection with money from Reid Hoffman and others.
Yeah, and Reid Hoffman had an operational role, wasn't he? Co-CEO or chairman?
Chairman, I think. And Reid is leaning into AI heavily. And then clearly what happened here is Microsoft seduced Mustafa to want to go and join them. Because of the DOJ, Microsoft couldn't just acquire Inflection AI because it probably would have been blocked. So instead, they've licensed the software for $650 million and hired the founding team. And the assets remain with the company, and they've now got money.
But it sounds like what they did in some ways with OpenAI. One of the things that struck me about this is that Hoffman's on the Microsoft board. He's a multi-billionaire partly because of his sale of LinkedIn to Microsoft. So isn't there something troublingly incestuous about this arrangement?
Well, I think if you understand it through the prism of fear of the DOJ, you won't be far wrong. This is a very unusual.
So you're blaming the DOJ for this, Keith?
I'm saying the DOJ has made it impossible, and the FTC, impossible to do straightforward acquisitions. Therefore, people are resorting to weird structures to get what they want, which is the assets and the intelligence held by the target company. And we might see more of this. I mean, Google, I'm sure, can't always acquire the company, but
Google's a major investor in Anthropic.
Right, and they probably can't acquire Anthropic, but they might be able to acquire Anthropic's team and IP.
So what's Microsoft's game here? I mean, another reading of this would be that Inflection AI just couldn't compete with Anthropic or OpenAI or Gemini, so they folded, and Mustafa got a job at Microsoft. Is that credible?
Not really, because then Microsoft wouldn't have had to pay $650 million. So I think that isn't the story, really. The story is probably more driven by Microsoft's fear that OpenAI will end up not being controllable. And
so this is Microsoft trying to have another option.
Yeah.
In addition to OpenAI, it would be the technology from Inflection.
Yes, that's probably my gut instinct. And it also reinforces that AI is a world in which startups are leading, not the big tech players.
Yeah, but this comes back to what we've been talking about. Inflection isn't really a startup. It raised what, $2 or $3 billion. It was founded by Reid Hoffman, who's already one of the most influential figures in Silicon Valley. There's nothing, and Mustafa Suleyman, who was a DeepMind co-founder. So when you think of something like Inflection AI, it's the opposite of what Google once was, or even Apple with Jobs and
well, there is a rationale for that, which is that
I'm not blaming them. I'm not saying that
I'm going to explain to you why it is a startup, despite what you just said being true. That is that the starting bar for participation in AI is billions of dollars. So to be a startup in AI, somebody has to underwrite the price of entry, which is rising all the time. And you know, you look at NVIDIA this week, which we haven't talked about, but NVIDIA launched a new chip called Broadcom, I think it was called, or Broad something. And that NVIDIA chip is the starting price is $40,000 per chip. So the price of entry is super high. So startups that attract the right talent that can execute will need to attract large sums of money just to get going.
It's a very different kind of, I mean, at best, it's a very different kind of startup world than you and I knew back in the 90s, where I started a company on a credit card. You did the same thing.
I did the same.
So you've got to have billions of dollars. You've got to have powerful, wealthy friends like Reid Hoffman who have connections to Microsoft or Google or Apple. It's a very, I mean, for better or worse, isn't a criticism of tech, and it's not a defense of Lina Khan, but it's a very different world. And it also reflects this new Saudi $40 billion fund and the Truth Social News. Everything seems to be coming from above rather than from below.
Well, actually, the Saudi fund, 40 billion ends up being quite a small number in this context.
Right. No, I agree. I was actually surprised with that number. It's not a lot of money.
And so I would say it isn't top down. It is still bottoms up. Developers ultimately are driving this, because unless you can build something interesting, no one's going to give you money. But there are not many of those developers, and if you are one, you're going to attract, you know, a lot of what is available to invest in the future, and that's.
Yeah, and I wonder whether finally, Keith, has gone on. It's an interesting subject. Whether, as always, with bureaucracies like the DOJ, they're fighting the last war or yesterday's war. They should be focusing on these issues and not worrying about the Apple iPhone.
I agree with that. Did you come up with an alternative title to shame?
Shame on Keith?
It's still got shame in it.
Well, what's another word for shame? I don't think it is shameful. I think that it may be incompetent, but there's nothing shameful about it.
It's just words. But yeah, I think if you're incompetent, it is a shame. In South Africa, they use the word shame this way: that if somebody falls off a bike, the person who sees it says shame.
So it reflects incompetence.
Well, it's also got some empathy.
So is that the first sign of a thaw between you and Lina Khan?
Shame. I feel sorry for her. Exactly.